Good day, everyone. Now that we have already finished discussing the first lesson, which is the introduction to literature, today we are about to discuss a new lesson. Our new lesson for today is the divisions of literature and literary genres. This topic is just gonna be a recap for us because this has been discussed in our high school years. This lesson is a bit long, but we'll try our best to finish this as soon as possible. So, let's start. For our first topic, we have the divisions of literature. As you can see on the slide, we have here the diagram of literature together with its divisions, subdivisions, and its forms. Literature is the root of all, followed by its divisions, namely oral literature, written literature, and visual literature. Oral literature is literary works transmitted from one generation to another verbally. Written literature is literary works in printed form, while visual literature is presented in front of an audience. Under them are the subdivision, which is the prose and poetry, and its forms are the following: fiction, non-fiction for prose, narrative, lyric, and drama for poetry. You will understand more of the subdivisions and their forms later in our discussion. Let's start with the prose. Prose is the most typical form of language, applying ordinary grammatical structure and natural flow of speech rather than rhythmic structure. It is commonly used, for example, in literature, newspapers, magazines, encyclopedias, broadcasting, film, history, philosophy, law, and many other forms of communication. And we have two subdivisions of prose: the fiction and non-fiction. Fiction is the form of any narrative or informative work that deals in part or in whole with information or events that are not factual, but rather imaginary, that is, invented by the author. As we all know, fiction is a type of work that is not factual, meaning gawa-gawa lamang sa isipan ng author. And we have 5 literary forms under fiction. These are just the common fiction works that we encounter, and there are more literary forms under fiction. For the first form, the fairy tale, story about the kings, queens, princess, and princesses with a touch of magic. For this, the example we have is Cinderella. For a second form, we have the novel, a long narrative with an organized plot, usually with a maximum of 500 pages. For this, we have the example Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Next one is fables, story that uses animals as characters and with moral lesson. The perfect example for this is Aesop's fables. Parables, story used by Jesus in teaching the good news, like the prodigal son. Lastly, the legend, a story about the origin of a place or a thing. For example, ang alamat ng Ampalaya. After the fiction, now we have the non-fiction. It is a form of any narrative account or other communicative work whose assertions and descriptions are understood to be factual. Again, we have the 5 literary forms under non-fiction. The first one is the autobiography, life story of a person written by himself. For example, The Long Walk to Freedom by Nelson Mandela. Next one is the biography, life story of a person written by another person. For example, Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson. Newspaper, collection of news articles about various current events, like the Philippine Daily Inquirer. Magazine, collection of articles regarding the lifestyle of man, like the Yes magazine. The last is journal, daily record of personal events. Now, for the second subdivision of literature, we have poetry. Poetry is a form of literary art which uses the aesthetic qualities of language to evoke meanings in addition to or in place of the prosaic ostensible meaning. And we have 3 forms of poetry: the narrative, lyric, and dramatic. Narrative is a form of poetry which tells a story, often making use of the voices of a narrator and characters as well. The entire story is usually written in metered verse. And we have 3 literary forms under the narrative. The first one is the epic, a narrative poem about supernatural powers possessed by heroes and heroines. For example, the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer. Second one is the ballad, a narrative poem with harmony and rhythm. For example, Annabel Lee by Edgar Allan Poe. Lastly, the metrical romance, a narrative poem dealing with the emotions or phase of life, and the story is told in a simple, straightforward, and realistic manner. For example, Florante at Laura of Francisco Balagtas. The second form of poetry, which is the lyric. It is a genre of poetry that expresses personal and emotional feelings. In the ancient world, lyric poems were sung, accompanied by a lyre. Lyric poems do not have to rhyme and today do not need to be set to music or a beat. The first literary form under lyric is elegy, a lament for the dead. For example, Lycidas by John Milton. The next one is sonnet, a lyric poem consisting of 14 iambic pentameter lines. For example, the Sonnet 18 by William Shakespeare. The last literary form under lyric is ode, a lyrical poem praising or glorifying an event or individual, describing nature intellectually as well as emotionally. For example, America by Robert Creeley. The last form of poetry is dramatic. It is a specific mode of fiction represented in performance. The first literary form under dramatic is historical, a theatrical play with historical plot. The second one is tragedy, a theatrical play with the death of some major characters. For example, Hamlet. Lastly, the comedy, a theatrical play with a happy ending. Now, let us move on to the second topic of this lesson, the literary genres. Literary genre is a category of literary composition. Genres may be determined by literary technique, tone, content, or even length. For our first literary genre, we have the short story. A short story typically takes the form of a brief fictional work, usually written in prose. It is a short piece of fiction aiming at unity of characterization, theme, and effect. It aims to produce a single narrative effect with the greatest economy of means and utmost emphasis. Let's now discuss the 10 elements under fiction. The first one is characters, the emotional, mental, and social qualities that distinguish one entity from another, like people, animals, spirits, automatons, furniture, and other animated objects. We have 4 types of characters. The first one is the round character. A fully developed characters, they are prone to change. A round character is very similar to a dynamic one, in that they both typically change throughout their character arc. The key difference is that we, as readers, can intuit that the round character is nuanced and contains multitudes even before any major change has occurred. The second one is static characters. These characters never change, even from the beginning to the end of the story. A static character is the one who doesn't change. Many static characters are simply flat, and having too many is usually a symptom of lazy writing. However, certain kinds can serve a larger purpose in a story. These static figures tend to be unlikable, such as Cinderella's stepsisters and Harry Potter's aunt and uncle. The third character is the dynamic characters. They change or develop through the story. A dynamic character changes over the course of the story. They often evolve to become better or wiser, but sometimes they can devolve as well. Many villains are made through a shift from good to evil. The last type of character is symbolic character. They are used to represent something larger and more important than themselves, which usually ties into the overall message of the book or series. A symbolic character must also be used sparingly, so the reader doesn't feel like the symbolism is too heavy-handed. As a result, true nature of a symbolic character may only be fully understood at the very end of a story. Some symbolic examples is Aslan, symbolizes God or Jesus in the Chronicles of Narnia. Let's now move on to the functions of character. For the first function, we have the protagonist, the main character in the story. The second function is the antagonist, the opposing character in the story. Confidence, the conspirators or sidekicks of the protagonists. For the last function, we have foils, the mirror or backdrop of the main character in the story, in which they both have the same struggles but different results. For the second element, we have the characterization. It is the process through which an author reveals a character's personality. It's a gentle unfolding of a woman's confidence or a man's brilliant mind. We have three types of characterization. The first one is the expository presentation. Characters are described or explained by the narrator of the story. The second one is the dramatic presentation. Characters are revealed what kind are they through actions. The last type is the anthropomorphic characterization. This is how the writer turns divine or powerful beings, animals, things, and natural phenomena as people. The third element is the point of view. It refers to who tells the story, how it is told, or whose life even is centered in the story. We have three types of points of view: the first person, second person, and third person. For the first person, it uses I and we. The character tells the story. The second person uses you. The reader is the character of the story. For the third person, uses he or she. The story reveals different characters. We have 5 types of narrative voice. The first one is the omniscient. The story is told by the third person. The second one is the limited omniscient. The story is told by the third person, but with limited knowledge about the past happenings before the story. The third is the objective or dramatic. It relies on the external actions and dialogues and does not give opportunity to interpretations of the story. The fourth one is the framed narrative. It reveals whose point of view it is. It also tells the beginning of everything in the story or the origin of something. The last is the first person. The story is told by the character of the story. The fourth element is the plot. It is the series of events and actions that occur in a story. As you can see on the slide, we have the Freytag's pyramid or the structure of the plot. For the exposition, this is the beginning of the story where characters and setting are established. The conflict or main problem is introduced as well. Rising action. The rising action occurs when a series of events build up to the conflict. The main characters are established by the time the rising action of a plot occurs, and at the same time, events begin to get complicated. It is during this part of a story that excitement, tension, or crisis is encountered. Climax. In the climax, or the main point of the plot, there is a turning point in the story. This is meant to be the moment of highest interest and emotion, leaving the reader wondering what is going to happen next. The fourth one is the falling action. Falling action, or the winding up of the story, occurs when events and complications begin to resolve. The result of the actions of the main characters is put forward. Lastly, the resolution. The resolution or the conclusion is the end of a story, which may occur with either a happy or a tragic ending. Under the plot is the conflict. For the first conflict, man versus man. This is commonly known as protagonist versus antagonist. The second one is man versus nature. Ang kalaban ng bida is yung kalikasan. For the third, man versus society, yung kalaban ng bida, yung mga nakapaligid sa kanya. For the fourth and last, man versus self, or the internal conflict, meaning yung bida, kalaban niya yung sarili niya. And we have here some common plot devices. The first one is the flashback, shows the past event which causes the story or event to happen. The second one is foreshadowing, shows hints of future event that will happen because the present event or story. The third one is deus ex machina. It is when someone or something appears out of the blue to help the character to overcome a seemingly insoluble difficulty. The last one is cliffhanger, as an ending to an act, chapter, serial, or novel that leaves the audience in suspense with an unresolved and often shocking plot point. The fifth element of fiction is setting. It refers to when and where the story happened. The sixth element is the style. It is how the writers creatively delivered the story by choosing the best words or phrases he or she thinks that suit best. It is verbal identity of the writer. The seventh element is themes. Theme is the central or main idea of the story. It is rarely presented. The eighth element is the tone and mood. Tone is the narrator's attitude towards his subject and the audience, while mood is the atmosphere of the story. It may be happy, sad, or tragic. For the ninth element, we have irony. We have three types of irony: the verbal, dramatic, and situational. Verbal, what is said is opposite to what is meant, while dramatic, what the character believes is opposite to what truth the reader knows. For situational, what happened is the opposite to what is expected to happen. And for the last element of short story, we have the symbolism. A symbol is something that represents something else. In literature, a symbol is an object that has meaning beyond itself. For our second literary genre, we have again the poetry. Poetry is a literary work in which special intensity is given to the expression of feelings and ideas by the use of distinctive style and rhythm. Now, let us discuss the elements of poetry. Our first element is form. Form in poetry can be understood as the physical structure of the poem, the length of the lines, the rhythms, their system of rhymes, and repetition. The next element is lines. A line is a unit of language into which a poem or play is divided. These are the building blocks with which to create a poem. The third one is stanza. It is defined as a smaller unit or group of lines or a paragraph in a poem. Every number of lines has its own term. For 2 lines, we call it couplet. For 3 lines, we call it tercet. For 4 lines, we call it quatrain. For 5 lines, cinquain. For 6 lines, sestet. For 7 lines, septet. And for 8 lines, we call it octave. The next one is rhyme. It is the sonic imitation usually of end syllables of words. We have 2 kinds of rhyme. The first one is the end rhyme. It is in which the words at the end of a given line rhyme. Let's take a look at this example. The rhyming words day and may, temperate, and date is located at every end of the line. The second one is called internal rhyme. The rhyming takes place somewhere within the line and not at the end. For example, the rhyming words long and song, flowers and towers are located within the line. The fifth one is rhyme scheme. It is the pattern of rhymes at the end of each line of a poem or song. It is usually referred to by using letters to indicate which lines rhyme. Lines designated with the same letter all rhyme with each other. Let us use the poem After Death by Christina Rossetti. For our first rhyme scheme, we have the word swept. Therefore, we would label it as letter A, and all the words rhyming with swept will be labeled as A. This rule same goes with all the rhyming words of may, and we would label it as letter B, followed by the word fold with its label letter C, and the last letter, letter D, with the word his. The sixth element is rhythm. It can be described as the beat and pace of a poem. Rhythm is created by the pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables in a line or verse. Rhythm can be helped to strengthen the meaning of the words and ideas in a poem. The next element is theme. The theme of the poem is the meaning of the poem, the main idea that the poet is trying to communicate. The eighth element is mood and tone. The mood or tone of a poem is the feeling that the poet creates and that the reader senses through the poet's choice of words, rhythm, rhyme, style, and structure. The last element of poetry is diction. Diction is the poet's choice of words. The poet chooses each word carefully so that both its meaning and sound contribute to the tone and feeling of the poem. For our next topic under poetry is the poetic devices. Poetic devices are a form of literary device used in poetry. A poem is created out of poetic devices composite of structural, grammatical, rhythmic, metrical, verbal, and visual elements. They are essential tools that a poet uses to create rhythm, enhances a poem's meaning, or intensify a mood or feeling. For our first poetic device, we call it alliteration. The purposeful repetition of a consonant sound in two or more consecutive words, usually at the beginning of such words. In other terms, we call it the tongue twister. For example, a good cook could cook as much cookies as a good cook who could cook cookies. And the other example is the famous Peter Piper. The next one is repetition. It is repeating the words, phrases, lines, or stanzas. Repetition is used to emphasize a feeling or idea, create rhythm, and or develop a sense of urgency. For example, to the swinging and the ringing of the bells, bells, bells. Of the bells, 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 bells. To the rhyming and the chiming of the bells. Repetition is seen through repeating the word bells. We have two types of repetition. The first one is called anaphora, the repetition of a word or phrase at the beginning of successive lines or stanzas. For example, the word tomorrow is repeated at the beginning of every line. Our second type of repetition, we call it anadiplosis. It is a figure of speech in which a word or group of words located at the end of one clause or sentence is repeated at or near the beginning of the following clause or sentence. Let's take a look at our first example. She opened a cafe that ruined her financially. She opened a cafe that serves as her clause 1. A cafe that ruined her financially, that serves as her clause 2. Anadiplosis is seen through the words a cafe because it is located at the end of clause 1 and also located at the beginning of clause 2. Our next poetic device is inversion. It refers to the reversal of the syntactically correct order of subjects, verbs, and objects in a sentence. Sometimes it is called as anastrophe. That means turning around in Greek. English language syntax usually follows a subject, verb, object order. So anastrophe inverts that order for effect. For example, the greatest teacher failure is. And another example, in the face of pain, there are no heroes. The next one is figures of speech. A figure of speech or rhetorical figure is a word or phrase that entails an intentional deviation from ordinary language use in order to produce a rhetorical effect. We have here the common types of figures of speech: the simile, metaphor, personification, and hyperbole. For our first type, the simile. It is a literary term where you use like or as to compare two different things and show a common quality between them. For example, you were as brave as a lion, and the other one, he is as strong as an ox. The next one is metaphor. It is a common figure of speech that makes a comparison by directly relating one thing to another unrelated thing. For example, she was a rock star at our last business presentation. And another example, she was a wildfire of rage. The next one is personification. It is a kind of metaphor in which you describe an inanimate object, abstract thing, or non-human animal in human terms. It is used to create more interesting and engaging scenes or characters. For example, the tired old car coughed and whizzed and crawled down the street. Another example, that piece of chocolate cake is calling my name. Last figure of speech, the hyperbole. It is a figure of speech in which an author or speaker purposely and obviously exaggerates to an extreme. Examples, she's going to die of embarrassment. Another example, I had to wait in the station for 10 days, an eternity. For our last poetic device, the imagery. Imagery is language used by poets, novelists, and other writers to create images in the mind of the reader. Imagery includes figurative and metaphorical language to improve the reader's experience through their senses. For example, the night was black as ever, but bright stars lit up the sky in beautiful and varied constellations which were sprinkled across the astronomical landscape. For our third literary device, the drama. Drama in literature refers to the performance of written dialogue and stage action. It's a literary genre that allows actors to act out a writer's words directly to an audience. The following are the common types of drama. The first one is comedy. Comedy is a broad genre of film, television, and literature in which the goal is to make an audience laugh. It exists in every culture on earth and has always been an extremely popular genre of storytelling. For example, The Simpsons. The next one is tragedy. It is a literary device signifying a story or drama that presents an admirable or courageous character that confronts powerful forces inside and or outside of themselves. For example, Romeo and Juliet by William Shakespeare. The next one is farce. A farce is a light-hearted comedy that centers around a ridiculous plot that usually involves exaggerated and improbable events. Farces usually do not have much character development, but instead rely on absurdity, physical humor, and the skillful exploitation of a situation. For example, the movie Home Alone. The next one is romance. A romance is a type of drama and genre fiction which places its primary focus on the relationship and romantic love between two people, and usually has an emotionally satisfying and optimistic ending. For example, The Notebook by Nicholas Sparks. For our last type of drama, we have the historical drama. A historical drama is a work set in a past time period, usually used in the context of film and television. Historical drama includes historical fiction and romances, adventure films, and swashbucklers. For example, The Brave Heart. And for our last literary genre, the essay. An essay is a short form of literary composition based on a single subject matter and often gives the personal opinion of the author. And we have 4 types of essay. For the first type, the expository essay. In an expository essay, the writer gives an explanation of an idea, theme, or issue to the audience by giving his personal opinions. This essay is presented through examples, definitions, comparisons, and contrast. The second type of essay is descriptive essay. As it sounds, this type of essay gives a description about a particular topic or describes the traits and characteristics of something or a person in detail. It allows artistic freedom and create images in the minds of readers through the use of the 5 senses. The third type is narrative essay. Narrative essay is non-fiction, but describes a story with sensory descriptions. The writer not only tells a story, but also makes a point by giving reasons. The last type is persuasive essay. In this type of essay, the writer tries to convince his readers to adopt his position or point of view on an issue after he provides them solid reasoning in this connection. It requires a lot of research to claim and defend an idea. It is also called an argumentative essay. And that concludes our lesson for today. I hope you learned something from this lesson. Thank you for listening.